Well, hello everyone. This is our re-record for week 12. Glad you guys can join us online as we go through Revelation chapter 12 today. As with every week, our purpose, why we do this, we want to have Berean hearts. We want to search the scripture to discern and understand truth. And we want to answer two questions. What does this tell us about God's ways, His character, His mission? And how is this text useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness so the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work? So it's week 12. We're going to go through Revelation chapter 12 today. And we're going to ask some challenging questions depending on which interpretive framework we want to use for this book. But kind of a quick recap. This whole book is a letter to the seven churches, and within the seven churches, within the universal church, within the worldwide church, you have kind of three groups of people. You have a complacent church, you have a persecuted church, and you have a compromising church. And we saw those played out in the oracles to the seven churches, and we see those across the spectrum in our churches today. And the consistent vision, the consistent theme of this book is worship before the throne. It's the first thing John sees when he goes into heaven. As we go through the different periods of time, after this, before in the middle of the opening of the seals, there's a break for worship. In the middle of the trumpets, there's a break for worship. When the trumpet blows, there's worship. And then today, in the midst of the cosmic spiritual battle, there is also declarations of worship. Last week we introduced the two witnesses, we introduced the first mention of the beast, and we also introduced a period of time that's sometimes referred to as 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 42 months, a time, and a time and a half. And last week, if you remember when we taught on this, the first period of 3.5 years, roughly, when the Gentile court was trampled, it was one set of times. Then there was another, which was the 1,260 days that the prophets the two witnesses were testifying. Today we're going to hear of two more iterations of this same time period. And as we said last week, the interpretive framework you choose, we have to answer and kind of wrestle through. What do these references mean? Are they all talking about the same time period, like preterists believe, the 3.5 years of the siege of Jerusalem? Do they reference one long, multi-hundred-year period, like historicists, the 1,260 years, approximately between the rise of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation? Do they represent the entirety of the church age, like the idealists believe? Or do they represent one 3.5-year period or two 3.5-year periods of the tribulation for futurists? And then we got to kind of figure out if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1,200 periods of time, why is it mentioned 4, 5, 6 times? And we got to wrestle with some complicated questions. And we ended last week that the seventh trumpet blew and the mysteries of God that were preached as the gospel through the prophets was declared that the kingdom of God is the kingdom of the world. That the kingdom of God has come because of the King Jesus. And so this week we're introduced to a new vision, a new series of signs, the woman, her child, and the dragon. And we also hear about a cosmic battle in heaven. And so we're gonna have to wrestle with some complicated timelines here and interpretive positions. But to begin, I want to root what we're saying in how this would have, what are the thoughts and images that would have come to mind when the original hearers of this heard the message, when they hear about the events of chapter 12, where there's a woman who is pregnant, there's a dragon trying to eat that woman's child. The woman flees to the wilderness, gives birth, flees to the wilderness. The child goes to heaven, the dragon is defeated. That general storyline, like what would have come to their minds? And to do that, we need to talk about this guy, Ovid, and his book, Metamorphoses. Ovid is a Greek or a Roman writer who compiles Greek myths. And so Greek mythology was huge in Rome. Even basically what the Romans did was they took Greek mythology and they put Roman names to the Greek myths, and that's kind of where their storyline came. And so in his Metamorphoses, which it was published in about the year 8 AD, Ovid includes the authoritative compendium of Greek mythology. And in that, there's the story of Leto. Leto became pregnant by Zeus, and Zeus's wife Hera sends the serpent or the dragon Python to kill Leto. Leto is pregnant with Apollo and Artemis. Leto flees to an island, gives birth to Apollo, and then Apollo goes and slays Python. Okay, so there's a woman pregnant with a son. There's a dragon trying to kill that child. They flee to an island, a remote place. They give birth. The child comes back and destroys the dragon, and in doing so, heralds peace, a reign of peace in the Greek world, according to this myth. And this is so important because the Roman emperors identified themselves with Apollo. Caesar Augustus, who was the Caesar when Jesus was born, identified himself as Apollo. Nero identifies himself as Apollo. If we remember when we were talking about the locust army, we said that Apollo's image was a locust, like he was one of the animals associated with Apollo, and Nero identified with that. Nero, when he coined his money, had sun rays behind his head because Apollo was the god of the sun. And so what we have here is the Caesars believe themselves to be Apollo, or Apollo incarnate, or to stand in the place of Apollo and to be worshipped like Apollo. And just as Apollo was born from Leto, like the emperors believed that Roma, the goddess that embodied Rome, like the worship of Rome, birthed the Apollo Caesars into existence and gave them the divine right to rule. And so this is the story that would have been well known in the world of Jesus' time and the time when this was written. And something we have to remember about God is that when God speaks to people in specific places and times, he doesn't do so ignorantly. He is aware of the images, the concepts, the ideas that the culture of that world understands and uses. Kind of like when I preach sermons, or when Pastor Ryan preaches sermons, and we use parallels, or we use references to modern culture to try and convey truth. In this very class, I've talked about, when we talk about like a God's eye perspective in God's time, I reference Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf says, "A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to." And I've said that a lot in various classes when we talk about God's timing. So I'm using an image that may make more sense to us in a modern audience to try and convey a spiritual truth. And that's what God is doing in this vision. He is drawing on a myth that has very similar parallels. And it is a myth that kind of results in Caesar being worshipped as the God King, as Savior and Lord. And what God is doing is saying, hey guys, that's a great myth you believe, but here's the real truth. You believe that Caesar or Nero is the embodiment of Apollo, who defeated Python, who tried to kill him as a child. But let me tell you about the real God King. You think Caesar's the God King, but he's not. Let me tell you about the real God King, Christ, who the dragon tried to swallow at his birth and who ended up defeating him. And so that's the framework and the foundation we need to have when we approach this text. So let's, I want to read you a quote. It's from Revelation in the End of All Things, and it says this: "Citizens of the empire could be expected to see analogies between the woman in the story and the goddess Roma, who was the queen of heaven. Her son would be the Roman emperor who overcame the forces of evil and chaos so that light and peace could flood the world. Caesar Augustus was hailed as the new Apollo, for his reign was said to mark the beginning of a new golden age. The Emperor Nero liked to present himself in the guise of Apollo, his image on coins bearing the radiant beams from his head that were Apollo's trademark. So regardless of whether we believe this passage describes past events, present realities, or future events, we cannot escape that to the first century audience who heard this, who were Greeks, right? This is the message to the churches of Asia, the Greek world, and many of whom had been pagan at one point or were the descendants of pagans. These are the myths that would have come out. And so remember, the key theme is, are we going to bear faithful witness and worship God, or are we going to worship worldly power? And using this image accomplishes that very question. Will we choose to worship Apollo or Nero or Caesar, who thinks himself to be the son who was birthed in the wilderness and defeated the dragon? Or will we worship the Lamb of God, who is the son who was birthed despite and thwarted the dragon's attempts to destroy him, and is seated at the right hand of God and is victorious? The challenge of there is this worldly power that is seeking to draw you into worshiping them, and then there is the true power of Christ. And so that's the challenge. So let's read this. We're going to start, we'll go right through it. We'll do verses 1 and 2 to begin. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. So this is the first sign. We see a woman in the heavens, and we should just remember that this is not, this sign, this image is not a geospatial reality. There's not necessarily a being standing in the heavens where literally the sun is clothing her and she's standing on the moon and is wearing crowns with stars. It's a picture. It's not necessarily meant to describe the cosmos. And this image is most associated with Joseph. Joseph's dreams were when he had the 11 stars, the sun and the moon bowing down and worshiping him. And it is key to helping us identify who this woman is. Because that's the question. Who is she? There's kind of like three beliefs. Largely Catholic commentators view her as Mary, the mother of Jesus. And as you progress through church history, when the Catholics' positions and beliefs about Mary were more solidified, you start to see Mary depicted using these images. Some commentators view this as the church, but then we have to ask complicated questions of, well, who is the church pregnant with? And there are some answers to that. But the most likely is that the woman describes Israel, the chosen people of God. And she's pregnant, and as we'll see, she's pregnant with Christ. Then we're introduced to the next sign in verses 3 and 4. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour the child the moment she gave birth. So, we got this dragon. He's red. Warfare, bloodshed, conquest. If you remember, that was the color association with the red horse. 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. Remember, 7 is not necessarily the number of God. It is a number of completion or of wholeness. 10 is also a number of completion and wholeness. These talk about the power or the authority that this dragon has. And actually, as we'll see, that the 7 and the 10 horns and heads become really important depending on your framework. They associate it with the beasts of Daniel, or for preterists, and for futurists, it associates them with the beast of chapter 13. And we'll get there. And it sweeps a third of the stars out of heaven. And the question is, well, what does that mean? Is this literally stars falling? or what is most often associated with this is the fall of angels, and like Satan bringing the angels down. Others refer this back to like the fifth seal, that when it talks about a third of the stars falling. But the dragon wants to consume the child who is born, and like that's the nativity story, folks. Like, you know, there's no dragon precious moments figurine for your little nativity set, but we think about like Silent Night and like Away in a Manger, and we don't think of a cosmic battle that is going on when Jesus is born. And we'll come back to this and talk more in depth about that, but there's a spiritual reality that overlays, a God's eye reality that overlays the physical reality of what's going on. In the physical world, Israel, specifically through Mary, was birthing the Messiah, but in the spiritual realm, there is this battle, and there's a dragon who is seeking to destroy the Messiah so he can thwart God's plans. Verses 5 and 6, and she gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, a rod of iron. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So the male child is born who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. This is where we can most clearly identify this child as Christ. That statement we see mentioned earlier in Revelation. I believe it was in, well, I'm just going to look it up because better than guessing. It was in one of the oracles to the seven churches, and I believe it was to Thyatira. Yeah, so the one, and this is Revelation chapter 2, verse 26, to the one who is victorious and does my will in the end, I will give authority over the nations. That one will rule with the iron scepter and will dash him to pottery's pieces, just as I have received authority from my Father. So that's the message that Jesus is speaking to the church at Thyatira, and says, if you're victorious, just like me, you will have the power to rule with the authority to rule with an iron scepter. Which is a reference back to Psalm chapter 2, or Psalm 2, verse 9, and is a messianic identity or identifying passage. And so he's going to rule the nation with a rod of iron. And so the dragon is there when the child is born and wants to eat the child. And then we jump all of Jesus' life, and he gets snatched up to heaven in the ascension, where he sits on the throne right hand of God. And the woman flees to the wilderness, to a place God has prepared for her. It's not a haphazard fleeing. It's not something outside of God's knowledge. There is an intentionality in what God is doing in protecting this woman, his people, the chosen people, the covenant people of God, where she is nourished for 1,260 days. Once again, we see this time span brought out again. And we are going to have to ask ourselves, is this the same period of 1,260 days referenced in the last chapter? Is it a different period of 1,260 days? Does it overlap? Is it complementary? Is this now a third? Is the tribulation actually 10 and a half years? Like, we have to ask these complicated questions, because these times don't always line up properly. And I'm going to say this, for people who hold specifically a dispensational futurist reading of this book, this chapter is going to be the most difficult chapter to fit into that framework. And it's going to cause us to ask some very complicated questions. And then ultimately, there's some really convoluted theological footwork that we have to come up with if we want to hold an exclusively dispensational futurist reading. Just like other frameworks have had struggles with other sections of this book, specifically futurists struggle in this passage if we want to state that all of Revelation is talking about future events. Because Christ is born in Revelation 12, and that happened in the past. So either A, we have to identify this woman and child as someone other than Christ, if we want it to be said in the future, or we have to somehow come up with an explanation of why Revelation at least 4 through 10 or 4 through 11 are future events, and then we jump to the past, and then we jump back to the future. When the text doesn't tell us it's making those jumps, we have to make them to support our interpretation. So let's look at the different frameworks. Historicists. So if you remember last week, the historicists, they read the 3.5 years, the 1260 days, as being the 1260-year period of the reign of the Pope or of the Catholic Church. But now we see a shift. Historicists, wow, my voice just cracked. Historicists typically read Revelation 4 through 11 talking about church history in its external realities. What are the external threats to the church? And it's actually even Revelation 2 through 11, because we go back and saw all the emperors. And then here, historicists typically shift and see that Revelation 12 through 19 tells the same story, the same historical period, but looking more at the internal realities of the church, the internal struggles that the church faces. So here they see that the woman is the church, and she is pregnant, not with Jesus, but with the promise of growth. The church is promised that God will be with them. They will carry the message to the end of the age. The pregnancy is the hope of birthing the church. And they see the dragon, which is seeking to stamp out the growth of the church, as being imperial Rome. They see the third of the empire, the third of the stars falling, being the persecution that the Asian third of the Roman Empire faced under the Roman Emperor Maximum. So around the time of Constantine, the early 300s, there was kind of three regions of the Roman Empire. There was the Western Roman Empire based out of Rome. There was the Eastern Roman Empire based out of Constantinople, and then there was the Asiatic Roman Empire, which was the regions in like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, things like that. And that third was ruled by Maximum, who was persecuting them. And they see that the child being snatched up, the promise of growth of the church being snatched up to heaven, come to fruition when in 324 AD, Constantine assumes emperorship over all of the Roman Empire and ends pagan worship. There is no longer tolerance for pagan worship. And so the dragon of imperial Rome has been defeated because they're all Christians now. Preterists, though they typically identify the dragon and the images, 7 heads and 10 horns, with the beasts of Daniel. So in Daniel, there are 4 beasts that are described, I think, in, I don't remember which chapter in Daniel, but in Daniel it talks about the 4 beasts. And those are often identified with the empires that would persecute Israel. You had Babylon, you had Medo-Persia, you had Greece, and then you had finally Rome. And they see that the dragon, and so if you were to take all 4 of those beasts, and imagine they're like Play-Doh, and smash them all together, this conglomerate beast, like a megazord, right? And when you put all the beasts together and they make the mega beast, that mega beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. When you were to add all the heads and all the horns up of those 4 beasts. And so for preterists, this beast represents empire. That throughout history there has always been pagan, worldly, and imperial power that has sought to destroy the people of God, and it is occurring in Rome. And they see that it is still happening, and they identify it with like the culmination, like the pains of childbirth that are being described have been all of empire's historical attempts to destroy the promised Messiah, going back to Babylon, the attempts to thwart God's plan using pagan power. They see that the empire has been the various form the dragon takes throughout history. And they see the women fleeing to the wilderness are the faithful Christians who fled the city of Jerusalem prior to the destruction. And this period of 1260 days, the period when the woman, the covenantal people of God, right? And that's important we understand this. The early church did not see themselves as different from Jews, right? Paul doesn't see himself as not a Jew anymore. He is a Jew who worships the Messiah. He sees himself as the heir, the real heir of the covenant. And so the promise, if the woman represents the Israel, the covenant people, true Israel, stops being people who are born ethnically Jewish and starts being people who receive the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, as king. And so the woman, the faithful covenant people who worship the Messiah, flee from the city of Jerusalem during the destruction, and they are kept during the 1260 days. And for them, that's the 3.5-year period of the siege of Jerusalem. It also points to roughly the 3.5-year period when Nero persecuted Christians. Futurists. And once again, this is where we're going to start having complicated timelines. If the rapture happens in Revelation 4 and everything after that takes place in the future, how futurists identify this becomes very complicated. Typically, futurists identify Israel, the woman as Israel and the child as Christ. It's really hard to get out of that interpretation. Mostly because like the description of the child is references to Christ himself. The dragon is Satan, and they look at the 7 heads and the 10 horns. They will take. So because just something to understand, Satan is not really described as a dragon or a serpent again in this book. We start hearing things described as beasts. And so there is a beast that will occur, I believe, in the next chapter, in chapter 13, who has 7 heads and 10 horns. And so futurists conflate the dragon Satan with the beast based on the number of heads and horns that it has. But they typically see the dragon or the beast that comes is the revived Roman Empire, that during the tribulation, the Roman Empire will be made new again. The statement about the falling of the stars being swept down by the tail becomes fundamentally problematic because the simplest reading of that passage is Satan is the dragon, and we'll find in verse 9 it clearly states that Satan is the devil, or no, that the dragon is the devil, is Satan. That the sweeping of, like the Satan's fall, or the sweeping of the angels from down from heaven, seems to be the demons that followed Satan into rebellion, which according to Scripture happened in ancient history, in time immemorial. And so it's hard to explain who these stars are that are falling with Satan in a 100% strictly post-rapture future event. It also poses some real complicated questions about Satan's power, and we'll get to that in a little bit, and when we get to the next section. But anyways, the dragon attempting to kill the child refers to Herod's actions in an attempt to kill Jesus after his birth, which once again is a past event. By the time this was written, that was something that had already happened, and it's not a future event. And then we go from birth to ascension real quick. Jesus is ascended, and then the woman taking refuge in the wilderness. Now, so this is where dispensational futurists specifically have kind of said that, all right, the dragon and the child and the ascension, that all is past tense events that have already happened. The woman fleeing to the wilderness for safety, now we're back in times of the tribulation. They typically identify that either at the beginning or the midpoint of the tribulation. Specifically, they see it as when like the faithful Jewish people who reinstate Jewish worship and keep the law during the tribulation are persecuted by the Antichrist, and they flee to the wilderness. Specifically, they identify typically as Petra in Jordan. And they're there for the 1260 days or the second half of the Great Tribulation. So like the same time that the two witnesses are preaching, the faithful Jews have fled Israel and gone to Petra to hide. But once again, we're really having a hard time meshing these timelines and making jumps in time. Because remember, we have to be very cautious that we don't have a conclusion and then read Scripture to support our conclusion. And so if our conclusion is that all of this is future events, well, now we have to read Scripture trying to explain how it's all future events, and we get into some complicated theology there about how, except for this one part that's past tense, and then now we're jumping to the future. And we're gonna have to wrestle through this, right? And I'm not trying to pick on dispensational futurists in this section. I'm trying to talk about the reality because, one, that's the one we're most common with. It's probably the one we're most aware of, and it's probably the one that we've heard taught most and maybe believe most. And we need to understand its limitations, and we need to approach this humbly. And this is the kind of the nail in the coffin that it cannot exclusively 100% be only future dispensational readings. There has to be something more. Otherwise, the timeline doesn't work out. Idealists read the woman as Israel and the child as Christ. And for them, they look and say that, hey, since conception, Satan has tried to destroy Christ. Satan tried to destroy Christ as a child, as a human, but has been unable to prevent Christ's triumph. The third of the stars are the angels who fell in the rebellion, and the ascension of Christ frustrates Satan, who instead wants to take it out on the church. The woman's flight is the protection of the church throughout the entirety of the church age. For idealists, Satan couldn't defeat Christ, and so now he wants to take it out on the church. And the fact that the woman is being nourished throughout the church age is demonstrable proof that the church will endure. The church itself cannot be defeated because Christ could not be defeated. Individual Christians may be able to be defeated. We'll talk about that in just a bit. But the church as a whole, God's chosen people, cannot be destroyed. And that's what the idealists talk about. Now let's read verse 7 through 9. Then a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he, the dragon, was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. So Michael wages war with the armies of heaven against the dragon. And this is important that we understand something. Satan is not Jesus' counterpart, right? It's not like yin and yang where there's a balance of power between Satan and Jesus. Satan is a created being. Jesus is not. Jesus is God. There is an ontological, a spiritual, a theological, a fundamental difference between them. They are not the balance of each other. The closest parallel to Satan, the closest counterpart to Satan, is Michael, the commander of the armies of the Lord, also a created being, the archangel. And there's a ton more we can talk about that, but it's not like Satan and Jesus are in this constant battle for power or dominion in the world. Jesus is God. Satan is created being. And inevitably, as created being, he is fundamentally inferior to and subordinate to God. And so when we talk about spiritual warfare, we have to always keep that in mind. And we're going to talk a little about spiritual warfare in a minute. The dragon loses and is cast down to the earth, and he is described as the ancient serpent, the Satan, and understanding that the word Satan or Satanis in Greek, which comes from the Hebrew words we use, it means accuser. And so the primary role or function or description of who Satan is the accuser, the one who makes accusations against God's people. And describing Satan as the ancient serpent is hugely important, right? And here's why. If our concepts about who Satan is are based exclusively on the Old Testament, there are very few references to Satan or the devil in the Old Testament. Explicitly, there are only two. There is a reference to the Satan, the accuser, in the book of Job, who says Job doesn't actually love you. There is a reference to the Satan or the accuser in the book of Zechariah, who makes accusations against Joshua and Zerubbabel, the governor and the high priest of Israel after the exile. Other than that, there are no direct references to Satan by that term. And you say, well, what about the serpent in the garden? That's a great question. That is a great question. We live in a world where we have associated and conflated the serpent in the garden with Satan. But in John's time, that was not clearly identified. But what we do is what we have linked here in Revelation, it clearly states that describes Satan, clearly, I don't like using the word clearly about the Bible. It states that Satan is the ancient serpent, which we can now identify association with the people of Israel. Not the people of Israel, with the serpent in Genesis. And we live with 2,000 years of church history that have built that for us, that association for us, but not, in John's time, that was not evident. And here's a quote for you from InterVarsity Press's New Testament commentary. The dragon's remote past is defined by the term ancient serpent, which links him with the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The assumption that the serpent in the garden is the devil in disguise is common today in popular Christianity, but was by no means self-evident in John's time. Like the serpent in Genesis, the dragon in Revelation is being seen as the enemy of the woman. If you look in Genesis chapter 3, I'm going to read it to you exactly. It says that and when he curses Satan, or the serpent, it says, and I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Right? Which is identified as like a Christological claim about Christ defeating Satan. But in John's time, the statement that yes, that was clearly Satan was not self-evident, but Revelation helps put these pieces together. So Michael and Satan wage war, and the armies of heaven wage war, and Satan is cast down. And in verses 10 through 12, we have a huge victory proclamation. Now have come to this, and I heard a loud voice in heaven say. So somehow John is back on the earth. We started with the woman in the stars and in the moon and standing on the moon. Then she came to earth and gave birth. And John is on earth still and hears a voice from heaven. Now have come the power and the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser, the Satan of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows his time is short. So this is a victory cry from heaven. And it parallels the declaration of the seventh trumpet in chapter 11. The kingdom is here. And here we have a description of the kingdom. It's a kingdom of power and of salvation and of authority of the Messiah, of the Christ. Because Satan has been thrown down. And he says he's the accuser who accuses people before God day and night. Remember, I said that if we looked only at the Old Testament for explicit definitions of Satan, he seems to have access to the throne room. He was able to go before God and accuse Job. He was able to go before God and make accusations against Zerubbabel and Joshua. Maybe it was just Joshua. I don't remember exactly which one, but it's in Zechariah. Zechariah 4, maybe? And now there is this war waging, and he is cast down. His access to the throne room of heaven is gone. So what happens is during the period, the intertestamental period, the period of the Great Silence, as some would call it, when Jews interact with the Greek world, this is where we start getting robust development of beliefs about angels and demons and Satan and heaven and hell, because really the Old Testament doesn't talk about it that much. The Old Testament talks about Sheol. There's mentions of unclean spirits and clean spirits and angels. There's a few brief references to Satan. And then Jesus comes out the door in the Gospels and starts swinging and talking in language and images and terms that didn't exist when the Old Testament writers were writing. During the intertestamental period, Jewish scholars have a lot of time on their hands, and so they start to study and they start to develop understandings about God and about the nature of the spiritual realm. You start seeing writings like 1st Enoch and 2nd Enoch, which talk about the war in heaven and the demons being bound in the pit, which we see referenced in 2 Peter 2 and Jude. It's where you start seeing a lot of this development of beliefs about angels and demons and about Satan and his nature. But what Revelation seems to tell us is that prior to this conflict, this war in heaven, Satan had access to the throne room of God and could accuse people. And now, because of the triumph of Christ, because of the ascension of Christ, because of the victory won on the cross, Satan has lost that power. He has been confined to the earth. He no longer, and he has been hurled down. He has been defeated, and he cannot accuse you before God anymore. He has been triumphed over. And that's like the crux of spiritual warfare, folks. Satan is defeated. He's defeated because of the cross. He is defeated for all time, but he's still dangerous. And I think we want to try and make spiritual warfare this very complicated thing, and guys, it's not. Christ is victorious, and therefore you have victory. I don't have to win any victories. I can't win victories. Christ has already won all of the victories. 100%. It's not like Jesus did 99% of the work on the cross, and Chris, man, you really got to do that extra 1%. It says, right, he's gone down to earth and he's filled with fury. And it even tells us a little bit later that because he could not destroy the woman, he is going to wage war against her offspring. And the best example I can come up with is this. Imagine that Ohio State and Michigan are playing in the national championship. And as expected, Ohio State would beat Michigan. And the Michigan fans decide that they're going to riot. They're going to burn down the stadium. They're going to destroy buildings, flip over cars. They're going to just terrorize the city. They can do that all day, and it will not change the outcome of the game. Ohio State will have won. Michigan fans could burn down every city in the nation, and it won't change the fact that Ohio State won. The same is with Satan. It's an imperfect analogy. Satan cannot change the outcome of the game. Jesus won. All Satan can do is drag other people into his defeat. Satan is like, I'm having a bad day, so everyone's going to have a bad day. All Satan can do, right? He cannot defeat you because you have Jesus. All Satan can do is drag you into his defeat. He can lure you, tempt you, pressure you into giving up the victory you already have because of Christ and draw you into his defeat. He can say, I've lost and I want you to lose too. And he can lure you through whatever means he wants to try and get you to accept his defeat with him and join him in defeat. But, and so when we look at spiritual warfare, when we look at how we go about the world, we start not from a place of uncertainty, not from a place of fear, but from a place of victory. I don't need to go on the offense against Satan because Satan is already lost. When you look in Ephesians and it talks about the armor of God, it doesn't say, put on the armor of God so that you can charge into battle. It says so that you can resist the attacks of the enemy, so that you can stand your ground. You can maintain the victory that God has already won. And let's look at this, right? So Satan accuses our brothers and sisters, or he did. He can't do that anymore. And they, our brothers and sisters, have triumphed over him. How? By the blood of the Lamb. The victory. They didn't triumph over him by their good works. They didn't triumph over him by doing religious practice. They triumphed over Satan exclusively, wholly, because of the Lamb. Right? Then it says, and the word of their testimony, through their faithful witness to the victory of the Lamb. The Lamb won, they bear faithful witness to the victory of the Lamb, and that is how we overcome Satan's attempts to drag us into defeat. Satan can't pull us into defeat unless we allow him to, and we resist those attempts by bearing faithful witness to the victory that Jesus set in stone for all time. This is so crucial for us. Right? And when we taught this last night, the question came up of what role does prayer and intercession play in all of this? Well, one of the ways we bear faithful witness to God and to Jesus' victory is by obeying him. Jesus cast out demons by praying, by commanding, by using words. Jesus tells us to pray. It's about surrender and submission to God. It's, God, you are victorious. We pray and seek that you would bring the reality of that victory into our world, right? That is what our process, it's our partnership in God's victory. It is not necessarily taking authority over those demons, because they don't have authority because Christ is victorious. It's about asserting the authority that is already there through the blood of the Lamb and testifying to the victory of the Lamb. If I've heard accounts of numerous people from different groups and denominations that have been engaged in exorcisms and real encounters with demons, and it's not like in the movies, guys. It's not these it's not this big pageantry and pomp and circumstance and we want to make it something way more than it is. We want to feel like it's a struggle in this battle. And guys, it's as simple as saying hey. You've been defeated. You don't have power here. Christ's blood protects us. Be gone. That is fundamentally what it comes down to. We don't need to be afraid. We don't need to be worried. We don't need to this isn't even going into a UFC fight and we got to get real pumped up and psyched up. It's not that. They've been defeated. The blood of the Lamb defeated them forever, for all time. We partner with God through obedience and bearing faithful witness to them. And if you remember, for the persecuted church, the church who is hearing this, the churches at Thyatira and Smyrna, I believe, are the two persecuted ones here. Maybe it's Pergamum and Smyrna. I don't remember which ones. Some of the churches hearing this are ones who have been persecuted, who have been killed, have seen their family and friends killed. And what they're saying, what the message is telling them is, guys, bear faithful witness, and this too will be overcome. It doesn't change the fact that they're being persecuted. It doesn't change the fact that Satan is trying to pressure them into accepting defeat, into compromising and choosing to worship empire instead of worshiping and bearing faithful witness to the Lamb. So I got to give us some quotes. So from the book Revelation and the End of All Things, it says this: This vision is not designed to repeat what the readers already know, but to stress that Christ's death was not a triumph for evil, appearances notwithstanding. The dragon threatened Christ, but in the end it is Christ and not the dragon that ends up on their throne. It says there that they did not love their lives even to the point of death. That's in Revelation 12:11. And there's so much. They remained faithful witnesses. They remained obedient to God. They prayed. They interceded. We should pray and we should intercede. But it's not about just saying words. If I go into prayer fearing defeat, then I don't have the right heart to pray. Victory is there. It is already won. And that's the position that I need to go into things with. We're victorious. Now that victory is the reality in the heavens, in the spiritual realm, and it doesn't always seem victorious in this life. Christ was victorious because he was killed. And that's what that quote we just said. It did not seem like victory from a worldly perspective. But from a God's eye view, that victory was there. And that's the other thing we need to keep in mind when we talk about spiritual warfare. We do not gauge the victory, the success, the reality of spiritual warfare based on earthly perspectives. We gauge the victory we experience in the heavenly realms. And I got some quotes here. They loved their lives they loved not their lives even to the point of death. Revelation 4 Views, the book Revelation 4 Views says this: they did not love their lives to the death demonstrates that Christians' victory is measured not necessarily in personal survival, but by faithful martyrdom, by faithful witness. Revelation in the End of All Things says this: Christian readers might conclude that the deaths of the faithful constituted victories for the devil. It might seem that when Christians were killed, the devil was winning. But throughout Revelation, true conquering and true victory are accomplished through faith. Those who remain faithful even to death and who refuse to give up their commitments conquer Satan because they do not submit to his will. In the eyes of the world, Christians who lose their lives in order to remain true to Christian faith suffer a tremendous defeat. But in the eyes of heaven, they are triumphant because they share in the victory of the crucified and risen Lamb. Victory in face of the realities of this world is not measured by worldly success. And you can apply that to everything. The spiritual warfare that goes with divine healing is not measured by whether or not someone is healed. It's measured by whether or not we remain faithful witnesses to God. And I know that's hard, because from a worldly perspective, if divine healing and spiritual warfare worked, everyone would get healed. But here's the thing, the measures: will we remain faithful witnesses? Will we worship the Lamb, or will we worship worldly power? Will we remain steadfast and true no matter the cost? The New International Greek Testament Commentary says this: Christians can be assured that the serpent begins to battle against their bodies only after he has lost the battle over their souls. This expresses one of the major themes of the book. The suffering of Christians is a sign not of Satan's victory, but of the saints' victory over Satan because of their belief in the triumph of the cross, with which their suffering identifies them. Blessed are you who suffer for my sake. Right? That's what Jesus says. When we suffer for our faith, when we suffer the realities of attacks, whether it is from other people, whether it's spiritual attack, whether it is just the marks of a sinful, broken, fallen world, we identify with Jesus who suffered for sin and the victory that won for all eternity. And heaven rejoices. Rejoice, heaven. But the warning, the woe is, woe to you on the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you, and he is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. He recognizes he is defeated. He knows that the fullness of his defeat is going to be made manifest soon, and so he's going to try and draw as many people into defeat with him. So let's look at the different frameworks for this. Historicists, if we remember, they see this as a retelling of the events starting back in the year like 300. The woman and the child from the first 6 verses was the time of the reign under Constantine. For this is the reign of Julian the Apostate in the Roman Empire from 361 to 363. After about 40 or 50 years of Christianity in Rome, Julian the Apostate becomes emperor, outlaws Christianity, reinstates pagan worship, and is killed. And on his deathbed, he cries, "I've been defeated, O Galilean." And so for him, that was the spiritual war waging in the heavens, was when when worldly forces tried to take Rome back to being pagan, but ultimately they lost. Preterists, they look at, okay, the woman fled in verse 6. And then again we see it into the wilderness and was kept refuge. And then in verse 14 we also see the woman going into refuge. So the war in heaven doesn't happen after the woman flees. The war in heaven is the spiritual reality of what is happening in verses 1 through 6 on earth. So the earthly reality of 1 through 6 is that Israel is there, the dragon is trying to destroy it, Jesus is born, and then Jesus lives and then goes to heaven. And while that is playing out in the cosmic reality, we have the spiritual battle that is waging in the heavens. And so when Jesus physically couldn't destroy Satan, when Satan could not physically destroy baby Jesus, and when Satan lost the spiritual warfare that is partnered with that, then Satan chooses instead to go and seek to destroy the Jews and others who others who remain faithful to seeking Jesus, just trying to destroy the church. Futurists, they tend to read this event being the middle of the tribulation, or some being during the beginning of the tribulation, potentially the events of the 5th trumpet, and that becomes problematic. If we want to place the defeat of Satan being cast down to earth, in the middle of the tribulation, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what did Jesus do on the cross then? If victory does not happen until the middle of the tribulation, then what was the cross for? And so people have tried to come up with complicated theology, trying to explain why there are 2nd and 3rd and 4th, there's extra victories that were needed or whatever it is. It's just, there's not a great answer to that. Once again, this chapter is the hardest for futurists to come up with an explanation for, but this is also the most important chapter in all of Revelation. It is the framework for understanding the whole book. The point is, worship the Lamb because he's won. The victory, the battle is won. The battle is over. The outcome is set. Satan is dangerous, but they say he's defeated, but he is still dangerous, but the battle is already won, and it is won by God. This chapter is the key to unlocking the whole book. Idealists, this is that the events of verses 1 through 6 from a heavenly perspective. And the announcement of salvation in the kingdom, that is the new covenant. Jesus' death and resurrection, which is the casting down of Satan to the earth, is the proclamation of the new covenant. The kingdom of God, the authority of the Messiah, is one of power and salvation because of the blood of the Lamb and our identification with the blood of the Lamb. Right? Jesus won the battle. The blood is what brings us victory, but we have to choose to identify with it. We have to choose to testify to it, to remain faithful to it. Let's keep going. Verse 13. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, and a time and a half, or a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. And from his mouth the serpent spewed water like river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth, swallowing the river, that the dragon spewed from its mouth. Then the dragon was enraged, and the woman went off at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast to the testimony about Jesus. Your chapters or your Bibles may include that last sentence, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. That is associated with chapter 13. Remember, verses weren't added until the 1700s, but we're not going to cover that. That goes with the next chapter. So the dragon is out for vengeance. She's carried away for this period of 1,260 days, which, if we read this chronologically, where the child is born, then there's a war in heaven, then the dragon is cast down and pursues the woman again, we have 2 periods of 1,260 days. If we read that these are the same thing, that the time when that verses 1 through 6 are retold in verses 7 through 14, then we're hearing that same time period referenced again. And he tries to drown the woman with the water from his mouth, which is odd because when we think of dragons, they shoot fire from their mouth, not water. But he tries to shoot water from his mouth, tries to flood and wash the woman away. And we'll talk about what that imagery may mean. And the earth opens up to swallow the water and saves her. A quote from the New International Greek Testament Commentary says this. Because remember, and then when the dragon can't defeat the woman, he goes after her other offsprings. In fact, and the New International Greek Testament Commentary says this. In fact, the troubles of the persecuted saints occur now not because Satan is too powerful for them, but because he has been decisively overthrown. He does all the damage he can, but he cannot prevail over the church in any ultimate way. The readers can now know that if they compromise, they are not merely compromising with the world, but with the devil himself. Right, they are the ones that the devil is trying to attack are those who keep the commandments and the testimony of Jesus, or of the woman's son, or the testimony about Jesus. So, if the woman is Israel, the covenantal people, who are those that keep the testimony of keeps God's commands and hold fast to the testimony of Jesus? Well, it's the church. Like if we remember what we had talked about, that at this time, like the Christians don't really see themselves as not being Jewish. They're just the real covenantal people. The promises of the covenant, which had been promised to Israel, were absorbed or transferred or transitioned to those who rejoiced in the Messiah, Jesus, whether they were Jews or Gentiles. And so this is like the church. This is Satan coming after the church. So let's talk about the different views on this. Historicists, we left off with Julian the Apostate in the mid-300s, and they see, once again, they do read this chronologically, and they see that the woman's protection during this time, the dragon's efforts, were various heresies, internal theological conflicts that the church faced. Satan couldn't destroy the church from the outside by people like Julian the Apostate, so instead he sought to pollute the church from the inside through heretical beliefs. And you've heard me say this before, like Satan doesn't need to defeat a Christian, right? He doesn't need to get them to rebuke God and start worshiping, I don't know, a goat or something. He just needs them to shift their allegiance to God a little bit. He needs them to worship God and something else. He needs them to worship only 75% of God. If he can transition, or if he can draw people into rejecting complete and total faithful witness of God to only partial faithful witness of God, then he can drag people into defeat with him. And that's how the historicists read this. That you look at people like Pelagius and the Pelagian heresies, or Arian heresies, which have nothing to do with Nazis. It has to do with the followers of Arius, and other heresies that took place in the 400s that Satan was seeking to destroy right worship of God by bringing in bad theology to the church. Others, they see that this is the beginning of the age of the Catholic Church, and that like this 1260 years is that whole reign of the papacy that the true believers are being guarded through. The idea that once Christianity became the de facto religion of Rome and everyone became culturally Christian, true pietist right worship of God was something that was kind of relegated to the fringe, to monasteries, to places in the wilderness. It wasn't found in the streets of Rome. It was found in enclaves of faithful belief around the world. Preterists, they see once again the flight of the Jewish Christians out of Jerusalem into the caves during the Jewish War. The description of the flights on eagle's wings is reminiscent of God's language describing how from the Exodus, and you look in the book of Exodus and in Deuteronomy, God talks about he saved Israel on wings like eagles out of Egypt. And they even see the idea of like the attempts to try and drown over the Israelites, like you have the like the Red Sea and Pharaoh trying to force them into the ocean, or like the earth opening up to protect them from attempts to destroy the covenantal people, being like the sons of Korah, when the ground opened up to swallow them in the book of Numbers. The thwarting, for preterists, the thwarting of the devil in his making war against the woman's other offspring is the attempts to destroy. He could not destroy Israel or Christ, but now he will try and destroy the church throughout the age. Futurists, specifically those in the dispensational framework, see this as the Jews fleeing the beast and the Antichrist during the tribulation, and the floods coming after them are literal hordes of people attacking them and being swallowed up. Hal Lindsey famously identified that the wings of eagles, this is where America comes in because eagles are associated with America, and so the way that the Jews are going to flee Israel during the tribulation is that America's 5th fleet out of the Mediterranean or the 6th fleet out of the Persian Gulf is going to airlift Jews out of Israel, faithful Jews out of Israel, into the caves in the wilderness at Petra, and that is what's going to play out. That's probably a bad reading of Revelation. Maybe in the infiniteness, and like I'm not trying to say that I recognize that in the infinite possibility of who God is, that maybe that's what it is, but also I recognize that nobody before like the 1960s could have ever envisioned that that was the reading of Revelation, which leads me cautiousness toward it. Idealists, right? Satan is taking out his defeat by trying to destroy the witnessing church. For them, the 3.5-year period, the 1260 days, that represents the entire age of church ministry. And remember, we said last week or a few weeks ago that the parallels are that Jesus' earthly ministry was roughly 3.5 years, and so the symbolic 3.5 years is the whole era of church ministry. And so Satan is going to try and destroy the witnessing church from the ascension until the time of final judgment. A quote I have to close is from Revelation 4 Views. If he, Satan, can neither unseat the throne Christ nor destroy the church, yet individual Christians may not enjoy such immunity. Though individual Christians succumb to martyrdom, the message of Revelation is that the church triumphs in history and in eternity. So guys, that's Revelation 12. I know it may seem like I was a little hard on dispensationalists in this chapter. It's because this is the hardest one to read an exclusively dispensationalist view from. And unfortunately, they have to come up with some complicated theology to defend their conclusions. But this is the heart of what it means to be a Christian. We are rescued and saved because of the victory of Christ, the blood of the Lamb, and we testify and bear faithful witness to the Lamb through keeping His commands, through loving God, loving self, loving others, even to the point of death. And the experience of death or the experience of suffering in this life is not an indication of defeat, but a testimony of Christ's victory. Just as Christ's suffering on the cross was not an indication of His defeat, but of His victory. And so that's not to say that we still need to pray, we still need to seek God, but we must do so from the place of knowing that Satan is defeated. Satan cannot overcome you. All he can do is try and pressure you into compromising your testimony of victory. He can try and draw you into defeat with him. But if we remain steadfast in proclaiming the testimony of Jesus through obedience to Him, we will continue to remain victorious. I don't need to get to a point of victorious. I'm already victorious because Christ is in me and Christ is victorious. I stand my ground by bearing faithful testimony to that. So that's this week. There will be no service in the evening next week because it's Easter. What a great way to talk. I mean, Jesus' death and resurrection is the key to unlocking Revelation, and what a great way to do this study, but right before Easter. And 2 weeks from now, we will continue with Revelation 13. So, go with God.